I want to tell you something before I get into this. I wasn't supposed to be there. Not in any dramatic, forbidden sort of way. I just mean I was the kind of person who slips through cracks. Born in old Lagos, raised between the Lagos coastal slums and whatever scraps of education my mother could beg from the district aid programs, I got into Vailthor Academy because a consortium recruiter watched me rewire a broken cargo drone with a bent spoon and a strip of copper wire I'd pulled from a broken radio. He'd never seen anything like it, he said. I thought he was joking. He wasn't. So by the time I arrived at Vailthor, I'd already spent most of my life being underestimated. It felt normal by then. The ache of it had gone quiet, like a bad knee you learn to walk around. You don't stop limping, you just stop noticing you're doing it. But this story isn't really about me. It's about Yale. Yale Oduya arrived at Vailthor 6 weeks after the rest of us. Late registration. Something about document processing delays. Earth's biometric clearance system was notorious across the consortium for being hilariously, embarrassingly outdated. The processing towers at Nairobi Hub still used magnetic strip ID cards. I'm not making that up. In the year the consortium had been trading with 400 civilizations spanning 8-star clusters, Earth's central immigration hub was still swiping cards through a slot reader. So Yale showed up late. 6 weeks in, when the rest of us had already memorized the dormitory corridors, learned which food dispensers actually worked, figured out the unspoken hierarchy of the cadet lounge. She walked into Module 7C with one bag over her shoulder and that look on her face, not nervous, not trying to seem confident. Just present, like a person who had arrived exactly where she meant to be. I noticed the bracelet immediately. I don't know why. Maybe because everything else about her was so plain, gray cadet uniform, still stiff from the fabrication queue, no rank markers yet since she hadn't been processed. Her hair was pulled back in a simple twist. She carried nothing flashy. But there was this bracelet on her left wrist. Old, obviously old. The kind of old you can see in the way metal loses its shine and gets a certain warmth to it instead, not dull, just worn. It was a simple band, handmade by the look of it, twisted copper and what might have been iron wire, shaped into something like interlocking spirals. There were small beads worked into it, dark red, the color of old clay or dried blood, threaded between the metal coils. It sat against her brown skin like it had been there for years, like it had grown there. I didn't think much of it. I noticed it, then I went back to my reading. The others noticed it too, but they kept noticing. Let me tell you about Vailthor before I go further because the setting matters. It matters a lot. Vailthor Academy isn't a school in any sense you'd recognize from Earth. There are no semesters, no grades in the traditional sense, no diplomas handed out in a gymnasium while parents cry in the back rows. Vailthor is an orbital platform roughly the size of a small city, hanging in stationary orbit above Cathara Prime, a gas giant of spectacular, almost violent beauty, its upper atmosphere churning in ribbons of deep violet and electric gold. The platform has 7 main rings, each dedicated to a different discipline: engineering, xenobiology, linguistic synthesis, tactical theory, exo-environmental science, cultural diplomacy, and what the Academy quietly calls advanced human studies, a department that had been added only 11 years ago, specifically because no one at Vailthor had known what to do with human cadets. There are roughly 400 cadets at any given time. Maybe 60 of us are human. The rest come from across the consortium: Vethkai, Ril, Soluvari, Dreeken, Praxis-born synthetics who qualify for organic programs. It's a mix unlike anything Earth has, and when you first arrive, it's overwhelming in ways you can't quite explain. Not because the alien species are frightening, most of them are perfectly civil, if distant. It's just that the scale of their assumption is staggering. They assume, without malice, that humans are new. They assume we are behind, that we are catching up. They treat human cadets the way a very patient older sibling treats a younger one who has just learned to walk, encouragingly, with a sort of tolerant fondness that can curdle fast if you mistake it for respect. Our instructor for integrated field theory was Commander Valus, a Ril, which meant she was tall, gray-skinned, with those characteristic ridge formations along her jaw and the reflective secondary eyelids that caught light in a way that always made it look like she was thinking harder than anyone else in the room. She probably was. Real cognitive processing speed runs at roughly twice human baseline in abstract pattern recognition. Commander Valus was not unkind. I want to be clear about that. She was rigorous, she expected precision. She graded on outcomes, not effort, which is the only honest way to grade, really. But she operated, I think, with a quiet assumption baked so deep she didn't even know it was there, that the human cadets in her class were working at a disadvantage that patience might eventually overcome. We were charity cases who were trying very hard. That was the unspoken frame. I had been operating inside it for 6 weeks, and I'd mostly made peace with it. You learn to push through the frame. You find the gaps. Yale hadn't had 6 weeks to learn patience. She walked in on her first day and sat down in the back row, and within 20 minutes the frame was cracking. The first thing that happened was small. Module 7C runs morning sessions in integrated field theory, which is a discipline that doesn't really have an Earth equivalent. The closest I can describe it is, imagine physics, but the physics also has opinions about anthropology, and sometimes the equations care about intent as much as mass and velocity. Field theory in the consortium sense deals with the interaction of biological systems, any biological systems, with the energy fields produced by what they call structured environments. A planet's magnetic field, a ship's drive signature, an orbital station's gravity management systems. Humans interact with these fields differently than any other species in the consortium. Nobody fully knows why. It's one of the reasons the Advanced Human Studies Department exists. Commander Valus was running the class through a standard field resonance exercise, a diagnostic test used to calibrate individual field sensitivity. You hold a resonance probe, a slender rod about the length of a forearm, and you feel for the field fluctuations produced by a rotating mass suspended in the center of the room. Different species feel it differently. Vethkai feel it as a vibration in their sensory filaments. Rill perceive it as a pressure shift in their secondary auditory membranes. Humans, in my experience, and in the recorded experience of every human cadet who'd run this exercise before, humans mostly don't feel it at all. Or if we do, we feel it as a vague warmth or a mild dizziness, and we usually can't locate the source. Which is fine. The exercise isn't designed to favor any species. It's calibration. It's about knowing your own baseline. Valus went through the class one by one. The Vethkai cadets, 3 of them in the middle rows, responded with exactly the precision you'd expect. They held the probe, their filaments flexed. They reported values within acceptable margins. Valus nodded, recorded. A Dreekan cadet, massive and armored, held the probe and looked uncomfortable. Dreekan have extremely low field sensitivity. They're built for pressure resistance, not subtlety. Minimal perception, she told Valus. No embarrassment in it. A baseline is a baseline. Then the human cadets. Cadet Fenton went first among us, a broad-shouldered Irish kid from Cork who had the most relentlessly cheerful attitude of anyone I'd ever met. He held the probe, squinted, and reported a vague sensation of warmth. Valus recorded it with the slight flattening of her expression that I'd come to read as diplomatic restraint. I went next. I held the probe. I felt, and I'm being honest, a slight tingle. A buzzing maybe in my palm, nothing I could place or quantify. I said so. Valus wrote it down. Then she called on Yale. Yale walked to the center of the room. She'd been watching all of this from her back row seat with an expression I couldn't read yet, and she took the probe from Valus's extended hand. She held it for maybe 3 seconds. Then she said calmly, "The primary oscillation is at 14.7 cycles. There's a secondary harmonic at roughly 42. It's running slightly fast, maybe 3% above intended calibration. Your mounting bracket is loose on the left side." The room went quiet. Not dramatically quiet, just the ambient noise of shifting bodies and mild boredom stopped. Commander Valus looked at her probe, then at the suspended mass, then back at Yale. Her secondary eyelids flicked, a real expression of recalibration, processing something unexpected. "That is," she said slowly, "within 2 decimal points of the technical specifications." "The bracket, though," Yale said. "You might want to check it. It'll affect long-run calibration." Valus turned to her equipment panel. She ran a diagnostic, and I watched her expression do something I had never seen it do. It paused. A full, genuine pause, like a processor hitting an unexpected variable. "The mounting bracket," she said, "does show a 7% deviation in its seating." Nobody said anything. Then from the middle of the room, one of the Vethkai cadets, A tall, elegant creature named Sevala, who had been at the top of every field exercise ranking since orientation, said something in Vethkai. It was too fast for my translator implant to catch it cleanly. But the cadet beside him, another Vethkai who did speak to humans occasionally, leaned over and whispered to no one in particular. He said, "It's a parlor trick. The new human is guessing." The whisper carried. Rooms carry whispers differently in low-gravity environments, and Module 7C ran at 0.8 standard. Yale heard it. She didn't react, not visibly. Commander Valus cleared her throat and moved on. But I watched Yale sit back down, and I watched her left hand drop to her right wrist in what seemed like a completely unconscious gesture, her fingers wrapping around that copper and clay bracelet like she was checking it was still there. It was. After class, in the corridor, I walked up beside her. "Hey," I said, in Terran Common because I wasn't sure what her first language was yet. "Hey," she said, Yoruba accent strong, Lagos roots. I recognized it because I grew up hearing it. "I'm Myra." "Yale." We fell into step. The corridor was wide, curved. All the corridors on Vaelther curve, following the ring geometry, and busy with cadets from 3 or 4 species, all moving in their own rhythms. "That was impressive," I said, "in the field lab." She shrugged, not dismissively, just it didn't need to be made large. "I grew up near a refinery," she said. "Mechanical vibration is you just know it after a while, you feel it in your bones, you learn to read it. The probe wasn't anything special, just vibrating. Once you can feel vibration, you can count frequency." "But the secondary harmonic." "My grandmother fixed old generators," she said. "She taught me that if you listen past the main frequency, you always find the overtones. That's where the problems are." I looked at the bracelet. She saw me looking. "Hers," she said simply. "She made it before she died." I didn't ask anything else. It wasn't the moment. But I remembered what she said, "You always find the overtones. That's where the problems are." I filed it away. The way you file things that feel important before you know why. The mocking started in the second week. I call it mocking, though it was polite mocking, the kind that comes with plausible deniability, wrapped in the language of curiosity or academic observation. Vethkai in particular have a social behavior called Sevolt, which translates roughly as clarifying inquiry, but in practice functions as a very refined form of condescension. You ask questions designed to expose limits. The questions themselves are polite. The exposure is the point. Sevala was the primary practitioner. He was gifted, genuinely, infuriatingly gifted, and he had the particular smugness of someone who had never been made to doubt his own intelligence. He ran field exercises with a precision that made Valus visibly pleased, and he treated the human cadets with a specific brand of tolerance that says, "You are allowed to be here, and I am demonstrating my tolerance by not saying so aloud." The bracelet became a focal point. It was during the third week of classes in the common nutrition area, what you'd call a cafeteria, though the food dispensed was coded to species-specific requirements, so it looked nothing like any cafeteria I'd known on Earth. Yale was eating. I was eating nearby. Sevala sat down across from her with 2 of his cohort, and the conversation began the way these things always do, with something that sounds like friendliness. "That is a traditional Earth ornament, yes?" he asked, gesturing at the bracelet. His universal was perfect. Of course it was. Yale looked up. "Yes." "Handcrafted, primitive materials. I recognize copper, iron perhaps." "Yes." "Interesting." He tilted his head. Vethkai don't have the same neck range as humans, so the tilt is subtle, but it's their version of examining something with polite bemusement. "You know that copper interferes with certain field resonance measurements. You could be unconsciously skewing your readings." Yale looked at him for a moment. "Copper is diamagnetic. It doesn't significantly interact with the field frequencies we use in Module 7C. A tiny pause from Sevala. "You are certain?" "Yes." "Still primitive materials for a facility of this calibration." He said it lightly, casually, like it was an observation about the weather. Yale went back to her food. "Primitive materials built the first tools that got humans off Earth," she said. "I'm comfortable with the company." Sevala's filaments rippled, the Vethkai equivalent of a raised eyebrow. He exchanged a glance with his cohort. "Of course," he said smoothly, and the subject was dropped. But it wasn't dropped. It never really drops when someone like Sevala sets it down that carefully. Over the next days there were comments, from Sevala, from others, small ones. The bracelet became a kind of shorthand for everything they thought about human cadets and about Earth and about what primitive meant. The girl with the Stone Age jewelry, I heard it said, not cruelly, almost admiringly in the way that puts the subject safely beneath serious consideration. Yale wore it every day. She never defended it again after that first exchange. But she also never took it off. I started paying attention to Yale in a way that wasn't about curiosity anymore. It was about, I don't know exactly what to call it, kinship maybe, vigilance. She reminded me of the people back in Lagos who carry something heavy and never mention the weight. I started to notice things. She worked differently than the rest of us. Not harder necessarily. She didn't have that performance-driven frenzy that some cadets used to compensate for their own insecurity. She worked quieter. When we had reading assignments, theoretical texts on field mechanics, interspecies signal processing, quantum behavioral mapping, most of us read the texts. Yale read the texts, then she'd pull up historical records, old ones, human engineering records mostly from the 19th and 20th centuries. Earth stuff that the Academy database had archived, but no one ever looked at because it was considered foundational background. The before we knew what we were doing material. I asked her about it once. My grandmother used to say, she told me, that the people who figured things out the first time without knowing the answer in advance, they're more useful to study than the people who applied the answer after it was given. Because the first people had to feel for it, and you can learn to feel from reading how they felt. I thought about that for a long time. Then I started reading the old records too. The practical assessment came at the end of the first month. Velas called it a field integration exercise, which is Academy language for, we are going to make you do something complicated and watch what happens. The specifics varied by class. For ours, the exercise was this. In the center of Module 7 sees Practical Bay, a large hexagonal chamber on the lower ring with real field generation equipment, not simulation. There would be placed a Vethmara, a Vethkai field resonance engine, roughly the size of a human ground car, capable of generating a localized, structured field of considerable complexity. The cadets would work in pairs, and each pair would be assigned a diagnostic task: locate a specific anomaly within the engine's output field, identify its source, and propose a correction. This was not a beginner exercise. Velas told us, with what I read as careful honesty, that the first-year class average on this assessment was typically 31% success. Success meant correctly identifying both the anomaly and its root cause. Most cadets, she said, got one or the other. Pairs were assigned. I was paired with Cadet Dresch, a Praxis-born synthetic who was extremely methodical and pleasant to work with. Sevala was paired with his cohort mate, which seemed like an advantage. Several of the other human cadets were paired with non-human partners. Yale was assigned to work alone. I don't know if this was deliberate. Velas explained it. Yale had missed the standard pair assignment period during her late registration. Protocol provided for solo assessment in such cases. She'd be given a slightly different anomaly configuration to account for the workload difference. I watched Yale receive this information. Her face did nothing. She nodded. Sevala, I saw this, I'm not inferring it, looked at his partner and something passed between them. A Vethkai expression I didn't have a word for. Not cruel, just satisfied, like a bet settling in your favor. The Practical Bay had the quality of all serious test environments. Everyone pretending to be calm, the air carrying a thin layer of focus that feels like static. The Vethmara was warm. You could feel it from across the room, a low, persistent vibration that lived in the sternum if you stood too close. Velas walked us through the parameters. Each pair had a different target anomaly. We weren't told what the anomaly was, we had to find it. We were given access to standard diagnostic tools, resonance readers, field mapping tablets, harmonic analyzers. All current generation consortium tech, the good stuff. I had a moment before we started where I looked across the room at Yale. She was looking at the Vethmara, not analyzing it yet, just looking, the way my grandmother used to look at a pot she was about to cook in, like she was introducing herself. Then the timer started, and we all went to work. I'll give you the compressed version of what happened next, because watching a field diagnostic exercise isn't exciting moment to moment. It's slow, methodical work. You build a picture gradually. Dresch and I found our anomaly within 40 minutes, a phase displacement in the secondary field loop, caused by a calibration variance in the generation coil on the engine's eastern face. It wasn't complicated once we found the trail. I'm not going to pretend we performed miracles. Dresch's methodological precision was the real engine of our success. I mostly contributed by noticing a vibration pattern that didn't match the field map and saying so. Sevala's pair finished in 32 minutes and announced their results with the composed satisfaction of people who expected nothing else. Other pairs were still working. And then there was Yale. Yale was working in a way that made the rest of us look busy in comparison. She was still. Physically still, I mean. She'd placed the standard diagnostic tools on the floor beside the engine, and she wasn't using them. She had her left hand pressed flat against the casing of the Vethmara, the copper-end clay bracelet resting right against the metal of the machine. Her eyes were closed. Sevala noticed this around the 20-minute mark. I heard him say something to his partner, quiet enough that the translator didn't catch it cleanly. But I saw him gesture at Yale, and I saw the slight tilt of amusement in his posture. Someone else muttered something about trying to feel it. There was a small, brief sound that might have been a suppressed laugh from one of the Vethkai observers near the wall. Yale didn't move. At 38 minutes, I looked over and she was still in the same position. At 45 minutes, after most of the other pairs had finished and were logging their results, she opened her eyes. She picked up a piece of chalk from the floor marking kit nearby. She drew a circle on the casing of the Vethmara, not on the face any of us had examined, not the accessible diagnostic panels. On the bottom, the underside, a part of the engine that rested maybe 15 centimeters off the floor. Then she straightened up and turned to face Commander Velis. "The anomaly is in the base housing," she said. "There's a microfracture in the substrate material of the primary field emitter plate. It's running at about 40% of its normal conductivity. That's causing a backpressure in the harmonic loop, and the excess energy is scattering into what looks like field noise, but it's actually a coherent secondary emission about 3 orders of magnitude below the main output. The correction is a substrate replacement. You could patch it temporarily by adjusting the input flow rate down by about 16%, but it would drift. Better to replace the plate." The room was quiet. Commander Velis was looking at her tablet. She looked at it for a long time. Then she set it down and walked to the Vethmara. She lowered herself. There's not really another word for it. She had to bend to look at the underside, and she examined the area Yale had circled. I was watching her face. I saw it happen. The thing I'd seen a ghost of during the first exercise, but now in full. Commander Velis, who had run this class for 4 years, who had assessed hundreds of cadets from a dozen species, went quiet. Not the practiced quiet of a teacher maintaining neutrality. The quiet of someone recalculating. She stood up slowly. "The microfracture," she said, and her voice had a quality I hadn't heard from her before, a measured, careful quality, like she was putting words on a surface that might crack, "is present. You are also correct about the conductivity. The secondary emission, your characterization of its coherence is," she paused, "more precise than the standard diagnostic suite would typically provide. The correction protocol you've described matches maintenance specification within acceptable tolerance." She stopped. The room had that suspended quality, the quality of a collective breath being held. "How did you identify the base housing without the diagnostic tools?" Velis asked. Yale was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The vibration was wrong, not the field, the physical vibration of the casing. Engines with good substrate integrity vibrate differently than engines with plate damage. It's a different frequency. A different texture, almost." She paused. "My grandmother taught me. She said you always listen past the main note. The base plate was singing flat." Commander Velis looked at her. A long moment. Maybe the longest I'd seen a rill hold still when they weren't sleeping. Then she looked at Sevala. Then she looked down at her tablet. And she was silent. What happened after Velis went silent is important, and I want to get it right. She didn't say anything remarkable. She didn't make a speech. She didn't apologize for the small ambient condescensions of the class or address the whispers about the bracelet. She simply walked back to her assessment station, sat down, and began writing in her log. Later, I saw the assessment report because Yale showed it to me, in the corridor, with that same quiet expression that was becoming familiar to me. Later, in the technical notes section, Velas had written, Cadet Oduya identified the target anomaly via physical resonance perception, tactile and auditory extrapolation, in the absence of standard diagnostic equipment. Accuracy, complete. Method, non-standard but valid. No tool interference documented. And then, below that, in a line that wasn't required by the assessment format. Recommend review of standard diagnostic curricula. Human tactile resonance sensitivity may be systematically underutilized in current field assessment protocols. That last line. I've thought about it a lot since. It's not a grand statement. It's a quiet, technical observation by a scientist who encountered data she hadn't expected. But coming from Velas, from someone who measured everything, who was rigorous to a fault, who didn't say things without meaning them, it was something. It was the sound of a frame breaking. Not loudly, not with drama, but breaking. That evening in the corridor outside the nutrition area, I caught up with Yale again. We walked for a while without talking. The corridor curved ahead of us, and through the long observation strip on the outer wall, we could see Cathara Prime turning slowly below, all that violet and gold, unhurried, massive, indifferent to everything happening on this small orbital ring above it. Sevala will say you got lucky, I told her. Yes, she said, he might be right. I looked at her. You don't think so, though. She thought about it honestly. I liked that she thought about it honestly. Luck, she said finally, is usually just pattern recognition that happens faster than you can explain. You feel something right before you can name it. People call it luck because they can't see the pattern, but the pattern was there. She touched the bracelet without looking at it. My grandmother worked with machines her whole life, she said. Old machines, broken machines, machines nobody thought were worth fixing. She fixed them anyway. She said, once you've held enough broken things, you know what whole feels like. You know what's missing. We watched Cathara Prime turn. She never left Lagos, Yale said. She never left Nigeria, she never none of this. A small gesture at the corridor, the station, the planet below. But she knew things. She understood things in her hands and in her ears that I don't think they teach here. A small pause. I'm still learning her language. The bracelet is a reminder that the language exists. I didn't say anything for a while. Then I said, you should keep wearing it. She looked at me sideways. I wasn't going to stop, she said. End of part 1. The bracelet became something else after the field assessment. Not a symbol. Symbols are for people watching from the outside. For Yale, it was what it had always been, a piece of her grandmother, warm on her wrist. For the rest of us, for me, for Fenton, for the other human cadets who'd been sliding quietly under the current of assumption since orientation, it became something harder to name. A reminder that you already know things they haven't measured yet. I'll tell you the rest in part 2. Because what happened in the Cathara incident, that wasn't over. Not even close. Part 2, the frequency they couldn't read. Document classification, personal narrative unclassified continued. Field notes, Month 2, Veilthar Academy, Integrated Field Theory and Crisis Response Observations. Narrator, Cadet Myra Solano submitted, Terran Cultural Archive. Supplemental notation. Events referenced herein have been confirmed by Academy Record and Consortium Field Assessment Review Board, Case File 47 VT HFY. There's something that happens when a place is forced to reconsider something it believed. It doesn't happen fast, and it doesn't look like changing your mind. It looks like people getting quieter. That's what happened at Veilthar in the weeks after the field assessment. Not revolution, not dramatic reevaluation. Just a quality of silence replacing a quality of noise. The particular noise of easy assumption going still. Sevala didn't change overnight. I wasn't expecting him to. He was brilliant and he had the particular rigidity of people who are never wrong by accident. The kind of person who, when he does encounter something that challenges his model, roots it through a version of events where the model stays intact. Yale's result got rooted as exceptional circumstance. Atypical. Possibly luck, he'd said that to his cohort quietly and been overheard. But he stopped making comments about the bracelet. That was something. Velis, for her part, changed her approach in a way that was subtle enough that I don't think most of the class noticed. She began including tactile and auditory resonance exercises alongside the standard diagnostic suite. She framed them as supplementary for those cadets whose physiological profile favors non-visual field perception, and she used the language of inclusion rather than correction. But the exercises were there, and they weren't there before Yale. Yale took them without comment, performed them with the same quiet precision she brought to everything, and didn't appear to think about them very much. I thought about them a lot, because I started doing better in them too, better than I'd expected, better than I'd been doing with the standard tools. I went back to my grandmother's cooking in my head, the way she'd known a pot was at temperature by the sound of the water before it hit the boil, the way she'd known bread was done by the hollow knock of her knuckle against the crust. Listening past the main note. I'd grown up with that language and hadn't known it had a name. The galactic soldiers arrived in the 7th week. I should give them their proper designation. They were Unified Consortium Enforcement Personnel, UCEP, a mixed species unit whose function at training academies like Velther was both security and, periodically, live scenario instruction. Think of them as the difference between a military simulator and actual soldiers walking into your classroom. They ran assessment scenarios. Surprise ones, unannounced, designed to test how cadets performed under conditions that weren't controlled and weren't kind. I'd heard about these from second-year cadets. I'd been warned. They pick the moment you least expect it, a second-year RIL cadet had told me over food dispenser units one afternoon. And the scenarios are real. They don't tell you what's happening. They just let it happen and they watch. I'd stored this information in the part of my brain where I put things I can't control. The unit that arrived was 5 strong. Commander-ranked officer, Drevesh, a Saluvari. Saluvari are physically imposing, averaging about 2.5 meters, with dense musculature adapted for high-gravity environments, and a body language that broadcasts authority the way a sun broadcasts light, constantly without thinking about it. The other 4 were mixed, 2 Vethkai, 1 Dreekan, 1 human. Wait, yes, 1 human. I want to get back to that. They entered Module 7C during a morning session. Velis stepped back. She had clearly been briefed. The class had not. Drevesh looked us over with the kind of assessing gaze that isn't hostile and doesn't need to be, the gaze of someone who has already decided you are not yet what you could be and is here to determine how far you have to go. It traveled across the room, paused briefly on the human cadets. Not with contempt, just noting. This is a live field scenario, Drevesh said. The universal was accented but perfectly clear. You will be assessed on observation, communication, and response. There is an active anomaly on this station. It began 42 minutes ago. Your task is to identify it, characterize it, and propose a containment protocol before it reaches critical. A pause. The anomaly, he added, is real. Rooms change when you learn something is real. The simulation readiness that we'd all been quietly maintaining for weeks, the background hum of if this were a scenario, here's how I'd respond, collapsed. In its place came something sharper and colder. Fenton across the room sat up straight. Sevala's filaments went rigid, his species' version of high alert. I looked at Yale. She was already watching Drevesh, not with fear, with the particular quality of attention she brought to machines, that pre-introduction stillness, like she was learning the shape of something before she touched it. Drevesh continued. The anomaly has been identified by station monitoring as a resonance cascade in Ring 5's gravity management field. Current failure state, 18%. Critical threshold, 60%. Estimated time to critical if unchecked, 3 hours. Station evacuation protocols take 4 hours to complete. You understand the math. He said it flat, no drama. The drama was in the math. You have access to your standard diagnostic tools. You have access to this Bayes equipment. You do not have access to the Ring 5 control room. That access requires clearance above your current grade. Another pause. You will work with what you have. Then he stepped back, and the 4 UCEP personnel spread to the edges of the room, and they watched. What happened next was a kind of ordered chaos that I've seen happen before in Lagos, when something broke in the district power grid. Everyone started doing something, and the first 10 minutes of everyone doing something was mostly everyone doing the wrong thing with great energy. The Vethkai cadets began with a data pull, accessing the station's public layer monitoring feeds and mapping what they could see of the Ring 5 field status from here. That was smart. That was the right starting point. But the public layer feeds were running a 12-minute delay, a standard security buffer, which meant everything they were seeing was 12 minutes behind reality. Sevala identified this within 4 minutes and said so. Credit where it's due, he was fast. The Dreeken cadets moved to the physical diagnostic panel at the bay's eastern wall and started pulling raw signal data from the station's internal network. Also smart. But the raw data format required a translation matrix that none of them had loaded, and they spent several minutes in a format error loop. Fenton and 2 other human cadets had their heads together over a manual, an actual physical manual, a printed one that Fenton had apparently brought as a joke in the first week and never taken back to his room. The Ring 5 gravity systems were real manufactured, and the manual covered their general architecture. I was watching all of this and trying to find where I fit. I looked for Yale. She was sitting on the floor. Not collapsed, not overwhelmed. Sitting cross-legged on the floor of the lab in the center of the room, eyes closed. Her left hand was flat on the floor. The copper bracelet was touching the floor's surface. Drevash noticed her. I saw him notice. He was scanning the room with the practiced sweep of someone trained to assess group behavior. And when his gaze landed on Yale, sitting cross-legged, still, eyes closed, apparently doing nothing while the rest of the class scrambled, he paused. The pause lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then he looked at the human UCEP officer, the one I mentioned, who I hadn't gotten a good look at yet, and something passed between them. A glance, brief. The human officer was a woman, maybe 45, short and compact with close-cropped gray hair, and the particular physical economy of someone who had been trained out of every unnecessary movement. She wore the UCEP uniform with the ease of someone who'd been wearing it for decades. On her collar I could see markings I didn't recognize, not standard UCEP rank insignia, something else. She was watching Yale. Not with Drevash's assessing detachment, with something closer to recognition. 4 minutes in, Yale opened her eyes. She stood up, brushed off her uniform, and walked to the room's far wall, the wall adjacent to Ring 4, if I was orienting correctly. She pressed both hands flat against it. The cascade started in Ring 5, she said, not loudly but clearly. But it's not actually an anomaly in the gravity field itself. The gravity field is a symptom. The source is in the structural resonance of the junction column between Ring 4 and Ring 5. It's a harmonic feedback issue. The column is resonating at a frequency close enough to the gravity field's operational range that they're interfering with each other. As the cascade grows, the interference deepens, which makes the cascade grow faster. The room hadn't stopped. Cadets were still doing their various things, but they were doing them quieter. Sevala had stopped typing. "How do you know this?" he asked. Not dismissively. The condescension was gone, replaced with something genuine. He was a scientist, and he'd just heard a hypothesis that was more coherent than anything the data was giving them, and he wanted to know its source. "The floor vibration," Yale said. "I can feel the junction column from here. It's vibrating at 7.3 cycles. That's close to the Ring 5 gravity emitter's standard harmonic range. They're bleeding into each other." She paused. "Pull the column specs from the structural database. Look for that frequency in the safety margins." Sevala turned to his data terminal. "I will not forget the next 90 seconds. I will not forget them because I watched Sevala, who had the fastest field access speed in the class and who did not make data retrieval errors, pull the structural specifications for the Ring 4-5 junction column. I watched him find the harmonic safety range. I watched his filaments go completely still, the Vethkai equivalent of breath stopping. 7.3 cycles, he said very quietly, is 11/100ths of a cycle outside the safety margin. Yale nodded. It drifted. Probably a long-run maintenance issue. Normal operations wouldn't trigger it. But something in the last 42 minutes changed the load on the column, maybe a scheduled maintenance cycle on the adjacent system, maybe a temperature shift in the outer hull. Something pushed the column's resonance up just enough to kiss the edge of the gravity field's range. And once they touched... "Feedback loop," Sevala said. "Yes. A beat." "What's the correction?" someone asked. "Fenton, I think." "You can't address it from here," Yale said. "You need to change the column's resonant frequency, which means a physical intervention at the junction, either a damping material installation or an adjustment to the column's tensioning system." "But..." She stopped. "But what?" Drevesh asked. And his voice had changed, slightly. The same words, the same flat clarity, but underneath it listening, actually listening. "But the Ring 5 team is going to be working on the gravity field directly, which is the wrong end, which means whatever they do is going to be counterproductive because the field isn't the problem." She paused. "Someone needs to tell them to stop." The room was quiet in a way that rooms get quiet when the center of gravity has shifted. Drevesh looked at Yale for a long moment. Then he turned to the human UCAP officer. "Lieutenant Marin," he said, "verify." The woman he called Marin, Lieutenant Marin, moved. She had a different device on her wrist than the rest of us, a UCEP-grade communicator that bypassed the public layer delay. She accessed something, read something, and her expression did a very controlled thing that managed to be extremely expressive anyway. "Ring 5 control team," she said, "is currently attempting to directly suppress the cascade in the gravity emitter. They are 12 minutes into the intervention." A pause. "They've reported that the cascade is accelerating despite suppression." Of course it was. Because they were pushing against the symptom. The source was singing away in the junction column, unbothered, and every suppression push on the gravity field was creating a reactive ripple that fed the column's vibration, which fed the interference, which deepened the cascade. "How long before they hit critical if they continue current intervention?" Drevesh asked. Marin ran the calculation. 90 minutes, not 3 hours, 90. What happened next happened fast. Drevesh got on his UCEP communicator and contacted Ring 5 control. What he said, I only heard partially. Saluvari communications tend to contract fast into technical shorthand I can't follow, but the important parts I understood. He told them to stand down. He told them the source was structural, not field-based. He gave them coordinates. Ring 5 control pushed back. Of course they did. They were the specialists. They had been monitoring the anomaly for 42 minutes. They were mid-intervention, and they were being told by an enforcement officer that a cadet in a training module had identified their error. Drevesh said, "Run your models against a 7.3-cycle harmonic input from the Ring 4-5 junction column. Run them before you respond to this communication." A pause on the line. A long one. Then Ring 5 control came back, and I didn't need to understand Saluvari shorthand to read Drevash's expression when they did. He looked at Yale. "They're redirecting," he said. "Junction column intervention team is mobilizing." Yale nodded like this was a reasonable outcome. The room breathed. The cascade was halted 47 minutes later. Not from this room, from a crew at the Ring 4-5 junction with damping materials and a tensioning adjustment. But from this room came the correct diagnosis, and the correct diagnosis was the entire difference between intervention at 47 minutes and critical threshold at 90. 43 minutes. 43 minutes between this room's silence and a station-wide evacuation. I don't think most of the cadets did the full math in the moment. I did. I'd grown up in a city where the difference between one call and the next was the difference between a power district going dark for a day and going dark for a month. I was calibrated for that kind of math. 43 minutes. After the resolution, after Drevesh confirmed the junction intervention was successful, after the cascade index began declining, after the station monitoring feeds came off high alert, the room had that particular quality that comes after something real. Not the relief energy of a simulation well done. The quieter, more complicated feeling of realizing you were briefly standing next to something genuine. Drevesh stood at the front of the room and looked at the class. He was silent for a long moment, long enough that it became a different kind of silence, intentional, the kind you make. Then he said, "Cadet Oduya." Yale looked at him. Your identification of the anomaly source, your proposed correction framework. He paused. Where did you acquire that methodology? It was not a simple question. I could hear the layers in it. It was the question of a military officer who processes competence as information, who wants to know what created the outcome so he can categorize it correctly. Yale thought about it. I don't know if it's a methodology, she said. I just listened to what the station was saying. The floor, the walls, they're not silent. Everything that's stressed makes a sound. You just have to know how to hear it. Drevash looked at her for a moment, then at her wrist. The bracelet, he said, not accusatory, observational. It was in contact with the floor. Yes, it is conductive. Copper iron composition conducts physical vibration effectively, better than skin-to-surface contact alone. It extends your contact surface and improves signal fidelity. He said this with the flatness of someone describing a tool's function. Yale blinked. Yes, probably. I hadn't thought about it that way exactly. I have, Lieutenant Marin said. Everyone looked at her. She'd been quiet since the confirmation. Now she moved from the edge of the room to somewhere more central, and the quality of her presence expanded. The way presence expands when someone stops being an observer and becomes a participant. I spent 4 years in early Terran integration research, she said, before I went into enforcement. We documented over 200 instances of human cadets and personnel demonstrating what we called ambient field perception, the ability to detect environmental anomalies through tactile, auditory, and in some cases olfactory channels rather than instrumentation. She paused. We wrote a paper. It was filed. It didn't change anything. A beat. It should have. Sevala was quiet. I kept watching him because he was the one whose silence mattered most in that room. He was the one who'd set the tone of gentle, plausible mockery. The one who Sevault, his clarifying inquiry, had put the bracelet in a box labeled quaint. He was looking at the floor. Not with shame, I don't think. Shame would have been too simple, and Sevala wasn't simple. He was looking at the floor the way I'd seen very intelligent people look at a moment when their model failed, with the particular discomfort of intelligence turning on itself, examining the failure, trying to understand it. After a while, he looked up. Your grandmother, he said to Yale, she was an engineer. Yale considered. She fixed things. She never had an engineer's certificate. She wouldn't have known what to do with one. But she taught you to listen, to feel for resonance. Yes. And she passed it to you through, he glanced at the bracelet. Not through the bracelet, Yale said gently. The bracelet is just hers. What she passed to me was practice. Years of watching her work, of holding things while she listened to them, of learning which sounds meant something was wrong. A small pause. The bracelet just helps me remember to be quiet enough to hear. Sevala was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very carefully, I think I made an error in my assessment of your capabilities. It was not elaborate. It was not emotional. It was the statement of a scientist acknowledging incorrect data. But it was real. And in a room where so many things had not been real, the assumptions, the frame, the gentle mocking, real was worth something. Yale looked at him. Thank you for saying so. Lieutenant Marin stayed after Drevash, and the UCEP unit left. She asked to speak with Yale privately, but Yale asked if I could stay, and Marin shrugged and said yes. We sat in the corner of Module 7C, which had emptied of everyone except Velis, who was at her console writing, with the particular focused quality of someone revising their notes significantly, and Marin, who sat across from us with her hands folded and looked at Yale with the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for a specific conversation. The research we did, she said, in Terran integration, the ambient perception documentation, we found that human tactile resonance sensitivity is, we think, an artifact of evolutionary history. Humans evolved in an environment where environmental reading mattered enormously. You couldn't scan your environment electronically. You had to feel it, hear it, smell it. She paused. Most consortium species evolved on stable environments or were spacefaring early enough that their survival didn't depend on reading their planet the way yours did. Human nervous systems are unusually dense in peripheral sensory processing. The signal bandwidth from your skin, your inner ear, your proprioceptive network, it's enormous compared to Vethkai baseline, for example. Yale was listening. We didn't know how to document it in a way the consortium would act on, Marin continued. Because the methodology doesn't look like methodology, it looks like feeling. And feeling, in a culture built on instrumented precision, doesn't get taken seriously. A flat pause. Until it solves a problem that instrumented precision missed. What happens now? I asked. Marin looked at me like she'd briefly forgotten I was there. Then she assessed me quickly and apparently decided I was worth including. That depends on Cadet Oduya, she said, and on whether the Academy is prepared to accept that advanced human studies has been studying the wrong things. What happened next took weeks to unfold, and I'll compress it honestly. Commander Vallis filed a formal assessment amendment, not just for Yale's file, for the department's evaluation protocols. She recommended the incorporation of tactile and auditory diagnostic exercises as standard track components across the field theory curriculum. She cited two sources, the original Terran integration research that Marin had mentioned, and Yale's performance in both the field assessment and the crisis scenario. The amendment was reviewed by the department heads. It was not rejected. That surprised me, but when I thought about it more, when I thought about 43 minutes, and what those 43 minutes represented, I stopped being surprised. Institutions resist change until the cost of resistance exceeds the cost of change. The math had shifted. Sevala requested to be paired with Yale for the next practical assessment. She agreed. Their results were, I heard this secondhand, because it was a different module session and I wasn't present, extraordinary. Sevala's instrumental precision combined with Yale's ambient resonance perception turned out to be a diagnostic combination that outperformed either approach alone, by a margin that made Vallis stop mid-assessment, and make a note in what I understood was the departmental research log, not just the class record. Near the end of the second month, on a quiet evening when the nutrition area was mostly empty, and Cathara Prime was cycling toward its most spectacular quarter, the upper atmosphere doing that thing where the violet and gold ribbons catch the star's angle and seem to glow from inside. Yale and I were eating and not talking much, which was how we often were by then. She was reading. Old Earth records, as usual, this time something about miners in South Africa from the 20th century who had learned to hear rock stress before collapse. Listening to the mountain, they called it, a skill that had saved lives. I watched her read. I thought about what Marin had said, about human nervous systems, about the bandwidth of peripheral sensing, about the evolutionary weight of a species that had to read its world because it had no instruments. I thought about my grandmother's hand on a pot. I thought about the people who figured it out first, without knowing the answer, who felt for it. My grandmother never left Lagos, Yale had said. But her hands were here, on Yale's wrist, on the floor of a station orbiting Cathara Prime, listening to the frequency that would have gone unheard. There's a kind of knowledge that doesn't travel in books. It travels in hands, in practice, in the quiet repetition of someone who has held enough broken things to know what whole feels like. Yale turned a page. The bracelet caught the light from the viewport, old copper going warm in the planetary glow, the dark red beads sitting steady. It looked, as it always did, like something that had always been exactly where it was, like it belonged. The last thing I want to tell you happened on the morning we got our second-month assessment results. The class gathered in Module 7C, which by now felt different to me, not in its layout, which hadn't changed, but in its atmosphere. The way a room changes when something real has happened in it. Vallis went through the results with her usual precision. Individual breakdowns, area scores, recommended focus areas for month 3. When she reached Yale's results, she paused. Not long a breath. Cadet Oduya, she said, your results are these are the highest ambient field diagnostic scores we have documentation for since this department began tracking that metric. Another brief pause. The field theory scores overall are in the top tier. The structural resonance analysis, the work with Cadet Sevala, the combined output has been flagged for the departmental research archive. She looked up from the tablet. I want to ask you something, she said, and her voice had that careful quality again, the quality from the first field assessment of someone putting words on something that might be fragile. The methodology you use, is it something you can teach? Yale looked at her, looked at the bracelet. looked back at Valus. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I'm still learning it myself. My grandmother knew it better than I do. But yes, I think it can be taught. I think it just sounds different than what you teach here. A pause. Maybe that's the gap. Valus nodded, slowly. Then perhaps, she said, we should think about closing it. This is where I end my record. Not because the story stops here, it doesn't. Yale is still at Vailthor as I write this. The curriculum amendment is still being implemented, slowly, the way all institutional changes move. Sevala and Yale are still working together, and the results are still remarkable. Marin's old research paper is being revisited by a small team in the Advanced Human Studies department. None of that is finished. But this, the thing I want to say, is finished. Or at least, it's come to a point where I can say it clearly. There was a bracelet. A cheap, old, handmade bracelet made of copper and clay and iron wire by a woman in Lagos who fixed broken things her whole life and never once left her city. It was, by the standard of every sophisticated instrument in Vailthor Academy, an absurd thing to bring to a field theory class in a consortium training facility orbiting a gas giant in Rim Sector 9. They mocked it, gently, politely, with the plausible deniability of academic curiosity, but they mocked it. And then it listened to a station in trouble. And the station, after 43 minutes, and the silence of a real commander who was too rigorous not to recognize what she'd encountered, was saved. The bracelet didn't save the station. Yale saved it. Her grandmother's hands, translated through years of practice and proximity and love, moving through copper and clay and into the floor of a place her grandmother could never have imagined. But the bracelet was there, warm on her wrist, touching the floor. And it sang flat and clear and in the exact frequency that mattered, while the sophisticated instruments looked the other way. I've thought about what to end with. I keep coming back to something simple. The universe is full of frequencies. We have instruments for some of them. For the rest, for the ones that live in the place between measurable and felt, between data and understanding, between what you can prove and what you already know in your hands, for those, you need something different. You need someone who learned to be quiet enough to hear. Yale Oduya was that person. And the bracelet on her wrist, that old, worn, copper and clay bracelet that a grandmother made in Lagos, and a granddaughter carried to the edge of the consortium, that was the reminder. Listen past the main note. The answer is always in the overtone.